When you teach, you become highly self-conscious. You become self-conscious about a lot of things. Your voice, your bad hair days, your unchecked assumptions, but especially what and how you've been taught. For instance, I'm acutely aware of the fact that I was never taught museum studies. As a curator, I never really studied the museum. In fact, as I look back, I realize that my education was formed almost in stark opposition to museums. Weird. But let me back up. Allow me to explain. I have a master's degree in curatorial practice, which is notably quite different than museum studies or art history or other fields you might assume I belong to or understand. Here it is, my alma mater. I studied at California College of the Arts, a private art school in San Francisco from 2005 to 2007. The 100-year-old school had recently renamed itself, dropping the craft off of what had previously been called California College of Arts and Crafts. As a result, the students revolted with a craft-based uprising. The graduate campus at CCA was housed in a gorgeously repurposed Greyhound bus station that was renovated by a famous architect. Students worked in studios without doors and with flexible floor plans so as to stimulate interdisciplinary integration. My fellow aspiring curators studied alongside artists and designers, and we felt deeply impacted by the school's new and highly visible social practice program, in which one could earn an MFA by crafting social interactions, using relationship as medium. Throughout the school's curriculum and ethos was an emphasis on process, practice, and the boundaryless making of a creative life. In the post-9/11 pre-crash years of the early 2000s, we were comfortable enough to be challenged and privileged enough to prioritize curating as practice. We saw curating as a possible vocation, yes, but moreover, we saw it as a way of thinking, a personal identity, and a mechanism for engaging the world through the curation of projects and moments, places and relationships. Curate comes from the 14th century Latin word curate, which is both a noun and a verb. Historically, to curate is to manage or take care of something. A curate or curator was someone tasked with this care and even seen as a spiritual guide or one responsible for the care of souls. Early curators cared for collections of objects, libraries, sometimes live animals, and yes, lunatics. This latter example is actually, honestly, the most applicable to my creative work. You'll soon see what I mean. In addition to the primarily DIY projects that I'll discuss today, I've also worked for a variety of important museums and institutions where I've been gallery director, co-founder, consultant, and curator. And although I do a lot of education, I'm admittedly not a seasoned teacher. So stepping into the role of teacher here at Colorado College has invited me to reflect on my own intellectual lineage and on my teachers. Here are a bunch of my teachers. The top two, Lee Markopoulos and Ted Purvis, both died this year and are sorely missed in the art worlds that they occupied. As I watch our students unpack the legacy and import of the museum, I realize that my teachers, who are all curators, never overtly advocated for the museum. Why not? Well, for many of them, the museum was the institution. It was oppressively patriarchal and annoyingly bureaucratic. Museums hoarded objects, pandered to the wealthy, and created a false sense of what is public. They saw the museum as institutionalized colonization, as a systemic abuse of power that had seized the talents of too many creative people. The museum was the man, and it was a thing to challenge or topple or reinvent. In other words, my teachers were, well, they were anarchists. Although my teachers wore a lot of black clothing, they were not members of the Black Bloc. They did not advocate violence or participate in riots, though one made a study of them. Their anarchism was intellectual. It was creative fuel. For instance, nearly every lesson plan or class activity aimed to disrupt or dismantle the existing systems of power. This redistribution of power manifested at one point in the form of a course called Self-Determination, during which the instructor was absent for the first 3 weeks. By the time he arrived, half the class had dropped out, while the remaining students had initiated a plan for co-leadership that involved a bunch of student-led field trips and lots of beer drinking. Now, these teachers actually had very serious intentions and a great deal of hope. They believed that art could illuminate the institutional powers that perpetuate and uphold it. They believed art could experiment with political models and try out new ways of being. Art could be free. It could liberate and level. It could be a pathway and a refuge, an ethos and a culture. They believed art could make things better, and as curators, we were charged as caretakers of this necessary future. This audacious worldview infused my master's thesis research on an artist-built commune called Drop City that existed from 1965 to 1973, about 100 miles south of here. Anyone ever heard of Drop City? Well, 12 years ago, I had not. And so when I first saw a photograph from the artist Joel Sternfeld with a didactic label describing the place of its origin, I was consumed. Born and raised in Colorado, my regional history was filled with cowboys, Indians, and a bunch of miners. I never considered that my home state as an important part of countercultural history. I never imagined its connection to conceptually radical contemporary art. Drop City was made by 3 artists, Joanne and Jean Bernofsky and Clark Rickert, who had been students together at University of Kansas. While in school, they learned about a fresh, new, spontaneous art form called happenings that Alan Capro and other artists were experimenting with in New York during the 1960s. In Kansas, these students were also interested in shaking up the stodgy art world and started dropping art out of second-story windows onto unsuspecting passers-by. The artists dubbed this art form as droppings, and themselves the droppers. They were interested in creating the ultimate dropping, a kind of total artwork, an artistic situation in which they could be the art. They could live art. The droppers graduated from college in the mid-1960s. Disgusted with the Vietnam War and the clashes around civil rights, the droppers were uninspired about mainstream lifestyles and even angry about the lack of alternatives. And so they bought a small, dusty piece of land outside of Trinidad, Colorado, and set about building a civilization from scratch. Drop City was not so much built from scratch as it was built from scraps. Raised in working-class families and sworn off of jobs, the droppers had no money and therefore took up the practice of creative scrounging. Railroad timbers, abandoned buildings, junkyards, and trash piles. These became their sources of plenty. And so Drop City was created with secondhand lumber and chopped out car tops, inspired by geodesic domes and the teachings of futurist Buckminster Fuller. At Drop City, these artists could build a life the way they might build a sculpture. Likewise, a ditch could be crafted, a meal could be inspired. The droppers made a spinning painting and toured local colleges, staging light shows and performative droppings. They had nicknames and shared clothing and made comic books about being. In the mid-1960s, the U.S. highway system finally connected the country by road. Driving cross-country was a new kind of adventure, and the road trip became a lifestyle choice. In other technological advances, video cameras were now affordable, portable, and therefore widely accessible. Filmmaking was available to amateurs, and like so many other advances in the 1960s, became a tool for consciousness expansion. People came to Drop City to learn and build and be inspired. The droppers' open-door policy and their location in the middle of the country made Drop City a convenient way station for countercultural types moving coast to coast, from be-ins to love-ins to the summer of love. As a result of this physical and ideological movement, alternative living became almost mainstream. Drop City, with its funky handmade buildings, became a sort of cultural icon. More than 2,000 communes sprang up in rural places in the late 1960s and 1970s. The commune, and particularly its geodesic architectural vernacular, had come to symbolize the political intentions of the burgeoning counterculture. But Drop City's openness was too open. Too many people came, and the commune could not hold. Drop City ended over the course of years. Its slow decline was marked by drug problems and an act of mysterious violence, and caused, perhaps, by a loss of artistic concerns. By the time I learned about Drop City, it had been razed, with nothing remaining of the once vibrant compound. My thesis was not only a journalistic telling of this place, but it aimed to link the Droppers' experiment to contemporary social practice. It also proposed the commune as form. You know, like sculpture, like a mold, the commune could be a creative form to be used, replicated, changed, stretched, or challenged. It's no surprise that this fascination with communes as a cultural form would lead me to a contemporary group of artists experimenting in the same medium. In 2008, I met a group of 30-some artists who called themselves the Institute for Social Research. This group was part of a pedagogical experiment created by two international artist educators, Brian Connolly and Christian Jankowski, who threw their art school students together to become a commune. Living together in a large house in San Francisco, the students were excused from class for the entire semester with a single expectation: to make art their life and life their art. The group fluctuated in size, between 20 and 36 or so. They came from all over the world and spoke 17 different languages, so it was a curious challenge when they agreed that their only rule was to make decisions by consensus. The commune adopted the name Institute for Social Research because they felt the need to have a group identity and found the primary goal to conduct research on and through their togetherness. For Halloween, the ISR dressed as a molecule. Tied together, they navigated public transportation and nightclubs and Halloween parties as a single entity. At another moment, they slept in a circle with their heads touching in the middle in hopes of dreaming the same dream. Objects brought into the house were painstakingly documented after passing through the consensus process. And there were parties, very wild parties. I met the ISR at one of these parties, the infamous jacuzzi party. Two couches had been pushed together to face each other with plastic strapped to cover them. Boiling water was poured into the ad hoc tub from a second-story balcony, and everyone got in. I realized that the group had something volatile and fascinating, and if their collective energy was not harnessed, it would eventually disappear. And so I offered to be their curator. We worked together on two exhibitions, one in a Bay Area art center and another at a German museum. We produced a giant catalog to evidence the experiment and hosted a number of official and unofficial events. Funding from the German government funded multiple flights for artists to travel back and forth between the US and Germany. Gotta love those Germans. In fact, this project taught me a great deal about the difference between American and European institutions. When the ISR began installation at the Richmond Art Center, the staff was terrified. We could only work during business hours, had to clean up after ourselves, and pass a safety inspection before the exhibition could open to the public. They did, however, allow the exhibition to spill out of the gallery and into the storerooms and offices. The hot tub was recreated for the opening, but it was a constant battle with the director to give space and trust to this Institute for Social Research. At the Württembergischer Kunstverein, it was a different story. We were given the keys to the castle. I'm not joking. The museum director gave us access to the woodshop, instructions on how to use the crane, and a fridge full of beer. And then he left town for a week. Because the show traveled internationally, the only consistencies between the two shows were a bunch of videos and sound recordings, a few drawings, and the ethos of the ISR. More important than the artworks was the group's energy and their spontaneous creation. The show was called the Institute for Social Research and the Discovery of Art God, and the exhibition hall was an opportunity to constantly rediscover their deity, Art God, who was the spirit of creativity. And so the museum became a space for eating, drumming, making music, making zines, even sleeping. For a week, the public was invited into the museum to participate in the life of the collective. And yes, they were invited into the hot tub too. As you can imagine, my teachers were very enthusiastic about this kind of spontaneous practice. It falls in line with what has been called the dematerialization of the art object, a trend that since the 1960s has moved away from art being a physical, precious treasure and towards a more spontaneous, performative experience of art. Another influential anarchist principle is Hakim Bey's temporary autonomous zone. Bey asserts that the path to freedom involves the creation of non-hierarchical moments, temporary spaces, and social relationships that appear and disappear to elude formal power structures. For Bey, art is a key element in the making of these temporary autonomous zones. So when I saw the ISR open the museum's storerooms to art-seeking visitors, when I witnessed their homemade hot tub placed in the classical sculpture garden, when they filled the gallery with spontaneous jam sessions, I recognized the power of the temporary autonomous zone to also be interesting art. Thus began a series of projects that worked with art as moment and exhibition as experience. A slew of experimental retreats, dinners, field trips, hikes, and parties followed. One time I curated a camping trip during which I taught participants to build a fire and to sing in rounds. Another time I built a shelter out of sticks in the forest and deemed it a venue. Inside this camouflaged fort, I curated a series of events that I produced in and with the forest, with only the forest as audience. This era of small-scale ad hoc projects felt like curatorial sketching. It was practice. It was all very fun but terrifying work, as most of it was tinged with some sense of failure. Working this way required a certain amount of letting go, a trust in other people and in process. But it developed my courage and vulnerability, and maybe also my discernment. It also made for some great memories. For all this talk of radical spontaneity, I will have you know that curating involves a lot of organizing. Not only is it tons of logistical coordination, it also involves the organization of ideas. People like to ask me, how do you get ideas for a project? In other words, what is your organizing principle? As an accidental anarchist, it may come as no surprise that my answer is inherently non-hierarchical. I start most of my projects by looking at land. I let land speak to me, and then I build a project as a means of listening to it. Land is my primary interest. Land is where we live and what we use. We are bound to it by gravity and necessity. I see land as the ground which unites us, as the context for life on Earth, as the resource for our societies, and as the material form of the sublime. Land means different things to different cultures in different places, and I find that fascinating. When I build a curatorial project, it literally starts from the ground up. A few years ago, I had the opportunity to spend a month exploring the land of Miami, Florida. I had a residency there and was given a bike, a large map, and some highlighter markers. Not knowing what to do with my time or my mind, I rode the bike around and around, and after a time, I began to notice things. As a Rocky Mountain girl of the West, watery landscapes are always so foreign to me. And with these foreign eyes, I noticed Miami's abundance of fenced vacant lots. I saw these lots as formally beautiful, each one unique, a unique cube of space. They were hidden in plain sight, an architecture of disappearance. And they were indicative of something, of what I wasn't sure. I started mapping these lots around the city's downtown, and after a thorough examination, could estimate that 40% of downtown was fenced and vacant, but not for sale. I was mystified and curious, the two ingredients necessary for a project's impetus. The other ingredient necessary for most of my projects is a collaborator, and I found that in a local artist, a friend named Felicia Chizuko Carlisle. Together we gathered the necessary parts and even some funding for a year of research and development. On a side note to the universe, I sure would like to get more of these kinds of grants because it's so nice to get some money before having the whole project figured out. But really, this funding from Wavemaker, a regional regranting program run by the Andy Warhol Foundation, allowed me to visit Miami 5 times over the course of 20 months. During this time, Felicia and my combined interests in land use, non-traditional art forms, and experimental collaboration merged with on-site research to eventually inform a weekend of fieldwork and celebration shared with community partners and visiting artists, as well as neighbors, landowners, and local businesses. Since the project's conception in 2014, it relocated twice, as migration and speculation moved north along the Miami Avenue corridor at a seemingly unprecedented pace. Beginning with downtown Miami's many fenced vacant lots, the project followed the trends of construction and development to the Design District and eventually settled in Little Haiti, where artists, galleries, and small businesses, as well as large international developers, stake their claim on this transitional neighborhood. Miami is one of the fastest growing cities in the United States, of which Little Haiti is a microcosm. With a vibrant immigrant history, it is now facing gentrification. We secured the use of a fenced vacant lot in a residential neighborhood. Its specific location and its known history were offered as prompts for artists and others to interpret. An open call yielded a group of artists from other rapidly gentrifying cities who collaboratively designed their strategies for eventually engaging the lot in person, sharing research and ideas over the course of a year. Simultaneously, a group of local artists, activists, business owners, and neighbors were invited to propose ways to use the empty lot as a platform for sharing their work, their neighborhood, and their experience of the area's many challenges and changes. As the project evolved, central questions shifted towards issues of power, ownership, neighborliness, difference, and proximity. What does it mean to coexist in one of America's fastest changing cities? Can a weekend of public programming help us practice living together with integrity and awareness? The group planned to build a temporary encampment on this vacant residential lot to meet each other, develop a collective sense of place, conduct creative research, and make art. Amidst the daily activities of living outdoors, the group planned to take walks, share meals, and involve others in their creative fieldwork. Only portions of the project would be open to the public, while much of the programming was intended for the core group of participants to share and learn from each other in an intimate, if not entirely exposed, outdoor environment. I won't go into the details of how the project actually turned out, but I can tell you that the project was challenged by lots of uncomfortable cultural differences, the end of my collaboration with Felicia, and a hurricane that spared Miami but nearly ruined our project. As one of my more recent projects, Lot reflects a decade's worth of lessons and growth, and it provided me with a lot more lessons that I'm continuing to learn from. As the DIY side of my practice evolves, I'm increasingly interested in making experiences for small groups of people with longer durations. I like immersion and intimacy, and I like to curate these kinds of moments. I believe that artists are incredible researchers, and I want to keep working with them in uncovering and illuminating the complexities of specific places. Lot grew out of a lot of earlier experiences. one of which started back in 2009 when my sister, Nina Elder, and our dear friend Nancy Zastadil and I bought land in northern New Mexico. We accidentally happened on a land auction and decided to purchase an unimprovable patch of land that had been part of a 1960s land scam. It was dusty and sun-baked, part of an ocean of sagebrush with astonishing views of a circling ring of peaks. We'd always wanted to start a school, or a farm, or a commune, and decided nearly overnight to create an off-the-grid residency program called Planned. Practice Liberating Art Through Necessary Dislocation was a name and a mission statement all wrapped into one. Planned was a multidisciplinary organization that supported the development of experimental and research-based projects through a variety of on- and off-site programs. Headquartered off the grid near Tres Piedras, New Mexico, it was a hands-on, exploratory approach to do-it-yourself alternative living. We found inspiration in a legacy of pioneers, entrepreneurs, homesteaders, artists, and other counterculturalists who, through both radical and mundane activities, reclaimed and reframed a land-based notion of the American dream. Residence was a core concern of this residency, as we aimed to make a place by being in it. Direct experience and learning by doing were guiding principles for our DIY experiment. We set about building a house with scavenged materials and secondhand supplies. Over 4 seasons, 14 residents came from all over the world to have a direct experience of life without electricity or running water, or even a cell phone signal, in one of the most wild and beautiful corners of the West. We hosted many school groups and annual work parties, spoke at national conferences, published papers, and were finalists for a Creative Capital grant. Planned residents built rainwater filtration systems, a staircase, a wood-burning sauna, and an outhouse. They researched the history of our land and witched for water. Some artists made poetic sculptures in the landscape, while others turned bathing into a ritual performance. One artist even made a urine-powered battery. All came into a direct experience of power and powerlessness as their cell phones died and the sun burnt their skin, as the phases of the moon became timepieces and their muscles burned. In its 5 years, Planned taught us a lot about what artists can do and what it might mean to be stewards of a place. It also taught us a lot about arts administration and bureaucracy. We closed the program for many reasons, but most reasons pointed to a tension between our romance for renegades and our need to be official. It's hard to be iconoclastic and run a public program. It's nearly impossible for anarchy to thrive in a world of grant reports and IRS regulations. In other words, you can't break with the institution and be the institution at the same time. I've come to blows several times with institutionalism. Now I know I could blame my teachers. The name of my talk was something I improvised several months ago, but as I've worked my way towards this very moment, I realize its non-accidental relevance. Institutions have been a creative challenge for me. I've worked for and with the institution, but I've also battled, impersonated, and invaded them. Most often the institution was not noticed or has not noticed or cared, and I've honestly found more support within the realms of the DIY. But here's a strange phenomenon. Whether for entertainment or betterment or a testing of limits, some institutions like to invite disruptors inside. They want to be questioned and changed. They fear becoming stagnant. Yerba Buena Center for the Arts is one such institution. Based in San Francisco and started by artists, it is committed to supporting and presenting the cutting edge of contemporary culture, and they do that through the work of artists. So it made sense when my collaborators and I were invited to produce a project and a series of programs around our ongoing involvement with the nearby city of Richmond, California. It was 2008, and Richmond was a ghetto at the end of the train line. It was understood to be violent, poor, and in some eyes, a lost hope. Two fellow curators, Grace Cook Anderson and Julia Hamilton, and I were curious to understand the story of Richmond, and we believed our method of inquiry might uncover something different than what the nightly news was telling us. And we visited the city every week for an entire day without an agenda to see what we could learn. Where did we start? With landscape, of course. And as we walked and drove around the city, we asked people about their land. By connecting the dots and weaving different historic narratives together, we began to understand that the shape of the land and its proximity to the water had everything to do with its legacy of violence and poverty. We were able to construct a place-based timeline that connected the building of World War II-era shipyards and the segregation of the armed forces to a series of countercultural groups and moments that led us straight into the present moment. In the process, we met teenagers, park rangers, former gang members, grandmothers, artists, activists, and a bunch of folks who had recently been laid off from the nearby oil refinery. When the museum asked us to produce a project about Richmond, we decided to invite these people in. After all, you can't have a project about Richmond without Richmond. Richmond folks generally don't go to the museum, and the museum folks generally don't go to Richmond, so we knew we had to get them into each other's spaces in a meaningful way. The space within the museum was turned into a study center devoted to the historic and contemporary voices of Richmond. We commissioned essays, conducted interviews, and presented the bulk of our research. We worked with local chapters of the Black Panther Party, the Congress for Racial Equality, and a really interesting group of ex-gang members who were occupying the streets with tent cities and barbecues to make safe spaces throughout the city. We hosted these folks for public forums at the museum and handed them the mic as a way to demystify their hometown. We arranged bus tours designed by locals that brought a museum audience to the places our local friends most cherished. None of it looked like art, but we didn't care. For us, art was a lens through which to consider things thoughtfully, even if the things we were considering were equity, politics, and the lives of strangers. In retrospect, the project is ripe for criticism in terms of community-based art practices, but at the time we believed our work enacted a kind of power-sharing social justice, and we assumed the museum might be a critical tool in this activism. After all, the museum purported validation. It presented opportunity and authority, space and power. But honestly, the museum ended up being the least interesting part of the project, and it may have actually deadened some of the life that we encountered during our year in Richmond. In the end, it seemed like the museum was most interested in adding Richmond to their demographics checklist and their annual grant report. The last project I'm going to talk about is also the most recent, the Museum of Capitalism. The mission of the Museum of Capitalism is to educate this generation and future generations about the history, philosophy, and legacy of capitalism through exhibitions, research, publication, collecting and preserving material evidence, art, and artifacts of capitalism, and a variety of public programming. Sounds impressive, right? The concept is massive, but the essence is actually quite small. In fact, the Museum of Capitalism is a conceptual project organized by artists, and it has materialized as a pop-up museum, a collection of artifacts, and a book. My collaborators conceived of their museum as a backward-looking museum of consciousness, akin to the Museum of Tolerance, mixed with a museum that intentionally blurs the facts, like the Museum of Jurassic Technology. They aim to understand capitalism as a thing of the recent past through the presentation of artworks and artist-generated programming. The use of museum-style presentation, interpretive didactics, and other traditional museum mechanisms were important to the museum being taken seriously, even as it asserted something that some audiences might find absurd. While the museum did not task itself with envisioning or articulating a world beyond capitalism, it tested a range of post-capitalistic strategies in the museum's gift shop, library, and school. As the museum was coming together, the organizers asked me to curate a thesis-driven special exhibition to inaugurate the museum and its recently acquired collection. Because all of my work begins with land, it made sense to explore the ways that capitalism is enacted on the landscape. Thus emerged American Domain, a group show of 10 artists who examined private property through their work about fences and walls, boundaries, and their trespass. The show aimed to illustrate that under capitalism, land has been measured, marked, bounded, guarded, and owned. It has been a commodity, a site of production, and oftentimes capitalism's dumping ground. Though land ownership is not an inherently American phenomenon, the United States was founded on a land grab, and several artworks called into question how this country's identity has been consistently wrapped up with the economics of territory. American Domain examined notions of property and ownership. The show was great, and it could have held its own in any museum. But this particular Museum of Capitalism was housed in a nowhere kind of space. The organizers obtained permission to produce this pop-up show that only lasted 2 months in a vacant, unrented building in Oakland's underdeveloped neighborhood, Jack London Square. They worked with landlords to build temporary walls and bring in electricity and make the building accessible to what they anticipated would be large crowds. Although the funding for the museum was substantial in the scope of artists' projects, it wasn't much when it came to building an exhibition hall in the shell of an unused building. But my collaborators made some interesting decisions that conveyed a museum aesthetic, and therefore a museum's authority, while acknowledging the spontaneity of their temporary project. They went the extra mile to install museum-style vinyl letters and state-of-the-art video projections, but they left the walls unfinished. The drywall tape showed because the walls were never painted. Aspects of the building's unfinished nature was intentionally highlighted, creating a feeling of either ruin or emergence. It was a sort of post-apocalyptic space into which an institution was being born. Though it was totally self-organized and low budget for a museum, it called itself a museum, which made it thus. It made things real and valid and true. Or the truth was at least sort of confused, and many people wondered, who did this? Who's in charge? While the museum was collecting objects and historicizing capitalism, it was also questioning authority. Who has the authority to describe history? And how does calling oneself a museum authenticate that authority? Another thing the museum did, perhaps inadvertently, was it made the vacant, unrented property suddenly very appealing to developers. The museum audience was not only typical museum goers, but also people in suits with clipboards and investors who could see the potential of the space now that it was alive with art and people. The Museum of Capitalism closed at the end of August and vacated the space soon thereafter. The capitalists moved in, and the Museum of Capitalism moved on. I'm not sure where or how it will resurface, but I know that it will. During my class at CC, we've been thinking and reading a lot about museums and how they function. My students are smart and hardworking and brave and curious in their interrogation of the institution. We've stripped it down to its basic essence and found proof of dominion, elitism, and white supremacy. But we're also learning that museums can be porous and malleable. The museum can listen and change. It can amplify diverse voices and make room for disruption. If the museum is a basic structure or configuration, it can be shaped and shifted, changed and improved. We've come to understand the museum as form. My students' final projects are really super inspiring. They're working in small groups to propose museums for the future. They've surveyed the landscape and the history and found holes in the museum world that they think should be filled. They are going through the steps of writing mission statements, justifying collections, writing catalog essays, and even designing institutional space. It's a ton of work. I am impressed with their fearless address of this assignment. But what addresses me more is the vision they have for our future. You know what their museums aim to do? They aim to heal, whether it be through the Museum of Natural Disaster or the Grassroots Museum. They believe the institution can not only collect, educate, celebrate, transform, and catalyze all evolving trends in museology, but it can also listen and help, solve problems, and heal wounds. This is a stunning view of the future, is it not? My students understand something that my teachers did not articulate, and what I haven't seen clearly, that the institution does not need breaking, because it is, in fact, already broken. As museums are now tasked with healing brokenness, while cultivating mindfulness and a kinder world, museums are hopefully, essentially, teaching us how to listen. Thank you.